Welcome to the Women in the Arena podcast, a platform dedicated to honoring America's women veterans who dare greatly in all aspects of life. I'm your host, Sarah Scully. At Women in the Arena, we harness the power of storytelling to illuminate the human experience. Through authentic narratives, we honor the resilience, authenticity, and leadership of women who have served our country. Our name, Women in the Arena, pays homage to Theodore Roosevelt's legendary speech, The Man in the Arena, recognizing the remarkable contributions of women in traditionally male-dominated domains. Welcome to another episode of the Women in the Arena podcast. Today we're excited to have Kate Van Dam, Head of Strategic Growth at SkyFi, as our guest. Kate brings a wealth of experience from leading innovation at SkyFi to her distinguished career as a Marine Corps helicopter pilot. Kate is someone I could spend hours talking to and learning from, which makes me even more excited to share this conversation with you. Tune in as Kate shares her journey of resilience, leadership, balancing a high-profile career with her personal life, and much more. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Women in the Arena podcast.
Thank you.
It's so great to meet you in person, Kate, though I feel like I already know you through our communication leading up to now, but we're so thankful for your time. I know you juggle many hats, and the fact that you carved out some time for us on a Friday evening is special, so thank you for being here.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an honor to be asked to join the podcast, so I'm really stoked about this conversation.
Awesome. Let's start at the beginning. Tell us about where you grew up.
Yep, I grew up in South San Jose. I was the first daughter of a cop and a homemaker. My little sister, she's taller than me. I ended up being the short one in the family, but she's about 4.5 years younger than me, so pretty great beginning. I have an amazing family. And, growing up in South San Jose, there was went to public school, such a diversity of everything, culture, thoughts, socioeconomics. Really left high school thinking, nobody would ever tell anybody no based on those things, which turned out to surprise me a little later. But, it was just a great upbringing. My family, I broke the pattern as a fifth generation not going into the police department. I became a Marine instead. But my little sister was in the Secret Service, so she kept the law enforcement going. So, yeah, I think, it was a big focus on community and service in a way that I feel sometimes we throw that word around a little bit these days. And maybe just because so many people have done it, it's not valued necessarily as much in larger society as I think it should be. But we grew up with these values that, you were born in this amazing country and you were born into this family and you kind of got to pay it forward and nobody's going to pat you on the back for it. It's just kind of became how we were taught to live and how we were taught to exist. And so it was pretty natural to go into the military, for my sister to go into, Secret Service, and here we are.
I really like that definition of service, too. It's do it because you should and don't expect to thank you for it. I love that. And then you went to the Naval Academy.
I did, yeah. So nobody in my family before me had graduated from a 4-year college. So it wasn't some legacy to follow. I think my dad was excited because it was a strict environment. I was excited because it was Division I volleyball, and this great adventure. And there's no money set aside for college. So I think the economics of it. I think my mother was just scared but always supportive. She's always been supportive of all my crazy ideas. I showed up in May of 2001, expecting to have some pirate adventure on the high seas. It was kind of disappointing the first time I went on a Navy ship and realized, nobody's hoisting any sails. But, pretty quickly thereafter, obviously, September 11th happened. I was a plebe, a freshman there. And it really kind of changed everything, I think, as it did to all of our generation. That's such a defining moment. You look back, and the moment that was defining before that was probably when the Berlin Wall fell in 89, right? So you're looking at 2001 and all of us who were not just old enough to remember it, but old enough to, end up participating in what followed. such a defining moment in history, but especially for our generation. And I remember that moment kind of thinking, all right, Kate, you got to get serious about this. Like, what do you really want to do? And I looked around, and the Marines, obviously the Marine officers commissioned out of the Naval Academy. And I just looked around at the Marines, and, I was around a lot of gutties and staff sergeants, and, lots of lamenting about how they were underappreciated and overworked and, underpaid. But at the end of the day, there was this pride in being a U.S. Marine that so strongly reflected what I'd grown up with in the police department, right? The firefighters were always the pretty boys, but nobody appreciated the cops, and I feel like I saw that very much in the Marines, and it just attracted me instantly. And September 11th was such a wake-up call of, all right, well, now here's the real thing. We're actually going to war. What do you want to do? And so kind of had to decide from there.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I have a little brother that just exited the Marine Corps, but there was about 4 years of talking back and forth between branches like that. Yeah. Awesome. And then, what was your experience like at the Naval Academy? I mean, I don't remember the year that, women first entered service academies, but, what was that experience like being a minority at a service academy?
Yeah. So 1980, so when I got there, it had been like a full generation, technically. It was interesting. I was an athlete, and I think there's a benefit to that, right? Like, athletes end up bonding with a lot of athletes. So, but the open discrimination, not necessarily from the leadership, but from some of the folks that I served, it completely took me by surprise. I remember even, looking at it more from an institutional perspective, I remember there was an MOS, so military occupational specialty. So your particular specialty when you're in the Marine Corps. I'm a hand talker, so if I knock this too much, Italian and a pilot, it'll get dangerous here soon. But anyways, back to the MOS book. September 11th had happened, and I was going through it, and I was like, artillery, that looks pretty rad. I want to do that. And I remember this officer saying, okay, you can't do that. I'm like, why can't I do that? He's like, you're a girl. And I'm like, I, in fact, am a girl, but I still don't understand the logic. And I was, going through, and even human intelligence at that time, the Marine Corps had closed to women, which mind-boggling on 1,000 levels, right? And it was really the first time I'd faced any sort of institutional, it wasn't even a stoplight, just a closed door, just for the fact that I was a woman. And it was a, I don't want to say a good introduction, but it was an introduction to certainly some of the uphill battles that I and all other women, I think, who even now sometimes are in uniform, will fight, and obviously there's a longer story further down the line of how I did, in fact, fight that. But it was interesting, and it was an early education in how to adapt, how to be legitimate. I think every minority, no matter what you are a minority in, you're so afraid of being labeled as the token. But that's such a caustic and defensive mentality from which to function that until we take that away, the individual isn't able to realize their full capability because they're always working defensively instead of thinking like, how am I going to be amazing and great at this and bring people along with me? It's more like, how am I amazing and great and nobody, tells me that it's just because I'm a whatever, and how do I fit in when really you kind of want people that stand out.
I love that. That was a beautiful answer. Well, you faced a barrier because of those policies that still existed at that time, but you did choose a pretty badass career. So tell us about being a pilot, and for our non-aviation listeners, the platform that you flew and what it did.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I was looking at what I could do, how I could go to war, had been told no multiple times looking at these different specialties, my question was, well, how do I go to war offensively? What's as close as I can get? And somebody says, well, just go fly Cobras. I was like, I don't know what that is other than a snake, so I'll go, I think Wikipedia. Yeah, I'll go Wikipedia that. And so, eventually I did. I, left the Naval Academy. And for all the listeners out there, I want to make sure that we keep things in check. Like, I barely graduated the Naval Academy. I don't wear that as a badge of honor, just like you two can do it with a 2.4 GPA. Learn to pay attention later in flight school. Went to Quantico at the basic school, and then went down to Florida to Naval Flight School. And I just worked my rear end off. I'd say I'm probably better when it's wiggling sticks than necessarily like some Socratic method of teaching, but I wanted to graduate at the top of the class because I wanted Cobra's West Coast. So when I got it, it was amazing. It was awesome. And what a Cobra is essentially a very skinny, beautiful, lethal helicopter. It's an attack helicopter. There's just 2 pilots in it. On the side, you have very large missiles and rockets, and below you have a gun. And I remember my very first time, like, actually seeing a Cobra in person was the day I showed up to fly it in Camp Pendleton. And it was the most, like, perfect first flight because we took off, and along Camp Pendleton sits along the coast in Southern California, just north of San Diego. And there are these really, like, tall cliffs. And on the edge of these cliffs are these landing zones that essentially mimic a boat, right? And so, we are a naval service, the Marine Corps. And so we're out there just practicing basically how to land a helicopter, because that's the hardest part of ever doing anything in a helicopter. And as we're landing and taking off into the sunset, as it sets over the Pacific Ocean, and it was just like, everything and more. And it really did set me up because my time in the squadron certainly had its challenges, I think, like any young officer, right? But it was an amazing experience, and that really kind of set it off well. Yeah.
Well, you commissioned and started your journey in aviation during war. So tell us about your deployments and experiences as a pilot during that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first deployment was actually on a MU, which is a Marine Expeditionary Unit, where Marines are essentially stationed on ships. You leave port and you sail around the world. All of the glorious port calls and everything like that. And what we didn't expect was the majority of our deployment was actually sitting off the coast of Somalia doing counter-piracy. And at this point in time, it was it's not a nascent profession, but in that area, it hadn't really gone to where al-Shabaab and various extremists were taking over, but that is obviously where it eventually went. But it was becoming a really big problem. And so it was a really unique mission to fly. Captain Phillips, all of that, our ship participated in that. And so it was a good, again, like kind of a more traditional peacetime, I guess, deployment, even though it was war. My second deployment was Afghanistan. So we were in Helmand Province in 2011. And it's really everything you join the Marine Corps during a time of war to do. It was an extremely kinetic summer, especially. We flew, we shot a lot. And I will say, like, from the, being a woman, that combat is the great equalizer, right? Nobody cared that I was a woman. Guys who previously in the squadron had in some way, shape, or form figured out a way to kind of kick me down a bit, whether in social situations or lamenting something that I'd accomplished. They didn't care anymore. And I never heard about it again. And it was really interesting. I really took that lesson forward into, kind of fighting against that entire institutionalized closed door in the future. But Afghanistan was such an experience. We shot for the Brits, Americans. You really want to see asymmetric warfare, do it from overhead, because you had these long logistics trains where which were just as easily exposed as the infantry battalions, and there were women and men, and again, like, nobody cared. They were shooting at the logistics trains, and you can absolutely read all the heroic things that women did in such a state of asymmetric warfare, which you actually see historically reflected in the Pacific Campaign in World War II. You had a lot of Black Americans who were traditionally, put kind of in these logistics, and they were usually the first ones on the beaches, right? And so really nobody had any more defense of a lack of capability. And so it was really interesting. I remember so we flew we flew assault aircraft, we flew escort aircraft around assault aircraft. Assault aircraft are usually your troop carriers, right? And so we would fly escort for medevacs. So if you think of us kind of like the bodyguards with all the guns and everything, make sure the landing zone was clear. The medevac or the casevac would come in, land, pick up the casualty, and we would stay overhead to shoot anybody shooting at the helicopter. And I remember the very first time that I was overhead and this medevac flight turned into what was called an angel flight. So essentially the Marine on the ground had passed. And I remember this overwhelming guilt that there was this young man down there whose mom, dad, wife, brothers, sisters, children didn't know he was gone, and I did. And I remember all I could think of was like, give them 24 hours, like allow this ignorant bliss for just a little longer because their whole world is going to turn. And I remember that was like an unexpected emotional reaction to something like, at that point, like I killed plenty of combatants, like all of that was different. But it probably struck me far more than I ever expected and far more deeply than anything else in combat. And it was kind of, like I said, the only way I can describe it is guilt. It was just like this very formative experience.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think guilt is something that a lot of combat veterans struggle with, and be curious, walking away from that experience as you move forward with your career, how you learn to live around those emotions and that grief and that guilt.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I don't lose sleep over, killing. Like, I'm also religious, so I think I find some solace in, like, that's a conversation between me and God. And so, but I think equally, the folks that didn't come home, we have to, or at least I feel the way to honor them is to discuss their service, to give praise to it. We all volunteered. I think sometimes that's forgotten in some of the narrative. And instead of turning it into like a sad trope of like really giving, I'm missing a word here, but really kind of praising that decision and their sacrifice and making sure that the stories continue. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do for those that we were over there with, or even our friends. I've lost friends who I wasn't in combat with, but we all served together, and their parents still want to hear these stories. And you can never tell those stories enough because there are no more stories. And I think that that's really important. And I try to weave the narrative into, sometimes when I write or sometimes when I'm just talking to folks of the stories of these people, because that's how you kind of keep them alive. And that's how you also, we all want to leave something behind, right? Some sort of influence. And that's how you enable that, is like sharing the story, like, oh, one of my best friends, Seth, he did this. And like my son, Seth died 15 years before my son was born, but my son knows the stories of Uncle Seth, and I think that that's really the best way that we can pay tribute to them.
Absolutely. I think, storytelling is why we're here right now. Yeah. It's such a powerful thing, and it ties into legacy. It ties into so many things, and honoring those that are no longer with us and keeping their stories alive. So thank you for sharing that. Coming back from your deployment, what did your last years in the Marine Corps look like?
Yeah, so I came home from deployment. I followed my husband out to the East Coast, and my last 3 years active duty, I was down at the basic school in Quantico, Virginia. So for listeners who don't know the basic school, essentially every Marine officer graduates OCS, so the academy, which is kind of like the basic boot camp, and then goes on to the basic school in Quantico, no matter what your specialty is. And so we spend 6 months there training Marine officers to be leaders. Most of that is done through basic infantry tactics. But really, I think one of the beautiful things about the Marine Corps, and we can do it because we're so small, is you learn all of the different specialties. So whether you're infantry, artillery, logistics, supply, you've done the other person's job, even just for a short time. And I think it's this natural cohesion, both social cohesion as well as like a professional cohesion and understanding there. So, spent 3 years in Quantico. It was amazing. The value that I got out of that was, again, something I didn't anticipate as much of. And even now, like when some of they're not lieutenants anymore, some of them are majors now, reach out. And it's really great to be able to put a little bit of your thumbprint onto the folks going out and take all your lessons. I took all my lessons learned as an officer and tried to imbue them of like kind of think outside the box, right? Question why things are done. That's always an important thing to do. Ultimately, you have to follow orders, but you don't have to be a robot. So that was great. While I was there were a number of, young women who sought me out just many officers sought me out for like kind of individual mentoring, but I saw this pattern of these young women. I mean, they were smarter than me, stronger than me at that age, like all of these different amazing things. And, more than one would voice her frustration that she wasn't allowed to join the combat arms, right? Kind of similar to me at that age. And at the same time, in 2013, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta essentially announced that he was going to rescind the combat exclusion policy, and he was giving the services 3 years to come up with any request for exception to policy. So essentially, at that time, it was still legal to keep women off of the battlefield and out of particular specialties or down at certain, like the battalion level and below for a lot of these, even if they were support. So a logistics officer in an infantry battalion was forbidden if the logistics officer was a woman. And he essentially said he was going to do away with that, but the services could request exceptions. So I had a crazy idea with 3 other amazing women. None of them were in the service at the time, that we should advocate for no exceptions. Essentially, let it go through, in the words of Martha McSally at the time, let the best man get the job, even if it's a woman. And, it was a pretty big advocacy campaign. I had spoken to a JAG ahead of time. I certainly did not make the commandant's office particularly happy, but I wasn't doing anything illegal. It was nonpartisan. It was really amazing because, you started to see these people come out of the woodworks, and you started to see men come out of the woodworks. And a lot of male infantry officers who had FET teams and CSTs, cultural support teams, that were like, yeah, I support it. Like, what do you need? And it was great because we had these men go, to like Capitol Hill and speak to more conservative or skeptical lawmakers and be like, yep, it's time. Like, this is already happening. We're losing out on talent by this artificial and archaic restriction. Let's lift it. So anyways, I could talk a ton more about that if you want, but that was, it was an interesting thing to do simultaneously while being an instructor at the basic school. But ultimately, it was about the Marine Corps having the best access to talent. and not to artificially limit itself.
Absolutely. And it's interesting hearing you tell that story because when combat arms was officially opened up to women, I was a cadet. And so I got to see in real time the effect of my friends having access to any job they wanted and being some of the first to do those jobs. I didn't myself go into a combat arms branch, but certainly had a handful of friends that blazed the trail in that way. And it was a crazy day when that happened. I actually remember, I think I was at PT in the morning and everybody was kind of whispering about it. Yeah. And it was just crazy. And it's crazy when you look back on that and you think what a shift in our military forever. It's a huge dynamic shift. Did you have any women that spoke out against what you were doing or voiced their concerns? And what was that like? Because it's a controversial topic, and it still is. It's still being debated to this day, especially on the topic of physical fitness tests, which are, career affecting tests as a service member. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I did. Openly, I would publish. I published on War on the Rocks. And again, always trying to come at this from let's just open it up, no quotas, one standard specific for the specialty, right? And no exceptions. And I suppose my time at the Naval Academy had maybe conditioned me a bit for it. But I was blown away on how I looked at some of these women, and I think some of them were trying to think deeply, and I love a good debate. But it kind of killed me because what did they have to lose by supporting it other than popularity? And the way we went about talking about it was so intentional. I was in Quantico, a lot of my friends were at the infantry officer course, right? Which there was a lot of outspoken. The Marine Corps is the only service that put in an attempt to do an exception to policy, which Secretary Ash Carter, didn't do. But and it was great because I had the opportunity to have these open conversations with these men who I was friends with. I'd shot overhead for them in combat, right? So it was also a moment where I look at the younger women and I'm like, you guys go through the door. I'm going to push it open and wedge it, or I'm going to break the hinges off, right? So it wasn't that I was looking to the younger generation to be outspoken, because there is just a certain amount of credibility that I had having been to combat, having shot for a lot of these folks, right? But because of that, they were willing to have kind of these uncomfortable conversations with me. And, I told this story recently, but it takes a lot to bite your tongue sometimes when, somebody who you really respect and who's now this big instructor in the infantry and everything says, I'm really worried about the medic having to drop tourniquets for tampons, right? And your instant internal reaction is are you kidding me? But my response was, brother, we've been in the field together. Have you ever carried my tampons? And I think that we're losing this ability to have these sort of conversations now, because what we're doing is we are shaming somebody immediately. And if you shame somebody, they're not going to come back and ask more questions. They're not going to be open to the idea. I knew some of these men were never going to openly be supportive, and most of them weren't, even if some of them quietly told me they were. But when the change came, our conversations would sit in their head, because I had faith that the change would come, right? That this would be open. And some of these men who were adamantly against it in these conversations have written me since then and been like, I got my first female, platoon commander, and they're the biggest supporters, right? Mm-hmm. Because they were there, they've seen it, they led these young women often in the basic school in Quantico. So when I look at that reaction from the men and my good faith and humanity was rewarded there, I just sometimes look at these women who were just so outwardly nasty about it, and I just think, what did you have to gain from that? And I don't want anybody to be silent, but there are so many ways to have a conversation or to refute a point or to question a point. And it was somewhat disappointing. But equally so, I got a lot of personal emails from much senior women who are like, I don't want to speak publicly, but I really admire what you're doing. And there was kind of some equal disappointment in that, a little bit of like, hey, ma'am, could kind of use some of your street cred here. Mm-hmm. But either way, it was good to like get those. I don't know. I appreciated that, but equally so, I thought, man, you got to get in the fight here. It's we get one shot at this, and then we're going to have to wait 15, 20 more years for the next war to get the next shot at it. So
I think there's so much to glean from what you just said. And I think especially today, thoughtful and peaceful conversations with people you disagree with is so rare. Mm-hmm. And I feel that is typically born out of fear. But when you look at leaders that have changed the world, they have the ability to have conversations with people that they, on an emotional level, fundamentally disagree with. And that's really the only way that we can create change.
Absolutely.
And the people that are sometimes the loudest and the meanest, they talk, but they don't change. So yeah. I really love that. And I think you have a very calming voice. So I could see you having a great debate with someone in a calming way, which is funny because you're such a warrior, but you have this calm demeanor that's so nice. So that's incredible. Moving forward, tell us about your fellowship that you did.
Yeah, so I got out of the Marine Corps, got off active duty, went to grad school for 2 years, and then did the White House Fellowship. So I highly encourage everybody who's listening to apply. It's really, really unique opportunity. Under the Johnson administration, they put together this White House Fellowship charter. The idea is to take people from their mid-career, mostly civilians, but also active duty military, and essentially bring them into the U.S. government on the executive side, into all these executive agencies at the very highest level, secretary or deputy secretary, for a year, and really just kind of learn how the government works, learn how the government makes these leadership decisions or decisions at the leadership level. The charter is like 11 to 19 people that get to do this, and it's unique. Along with it is this entire educational piece. So twice a week, we would go to the White House Fellows office right off of Lafayette, and we would have these true Chatham House, like proper Chatham House conversations. No phones were allowed, with existing lawmakers, former ambassadors, all these different people. We did 2 domestic trips, and the one in New York, like we're sitting in Jamie Dimon's like office talking to him. He's somebody I really admire, and we're talking to the Port Authority in LA, and then we went overseas to Japan as well, and that was really great. The ambassador there had been a White House fellow, so it was this really great exposure. Again, like anything else, whether it's the service or school or different opportunities, the cohort of White House fellows that I came through with were really, really unique people. They're going on, of course, to do amazing things. And funny story, I had originally gone, and when I heard about it, I was actually about to go kayaking with my husband up in Bend, Oregon, where my parents live. And there's this ridiculous picture of me doing some high kicks or something like that. But I show up and I'm like, okay, National Security Council, maybe I have this master's degree in economics, maybe something with trade. And I ended up at HUD. So that's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I thought, what the hell am I going to do here? I don't know anything. And domestic policy isn't anything that I've ever studied or lived. And I have to tell you that I grew as an American more that year than any other year in my life, except when I went to combat, because that was the largest, most expensive disaster year in the history of the U.S., even to date. And I worked under this amazing woman, Janet Goldrick, and she worked under the deputy secretary. And we, like, literally week 2, I'm in there with an entire room of 100 plus HUD employees, Puerto Rico online, and I'm running this meeting. And so it was not that I needed to be the expert, but essentially making sure all the experts spoke. And, I went out down to Texas to like help respond to Harvey, and you're like sitting there, talking to these people who've lost their government housing, who, you're trying to help them find new housing, get Red Cross on board and FEMA, worked a ton with Puerto Rico. And in response, obviously, to Katrina there and like just the basic logistics. And, we would go up to Capitol Hill, and housing isn't sexy. It's not a sexy topic. It's barely funded well enough. And there are certainly people in government housing that are vulnerable in ways that I think those of us who didn't grow up in government housing don't understand, because it's relatively overlooked. And so, it became this thing that I looked at in my community. I didn't need to look overseas. I didn't need to look at who the bad guys were coming to get us. I looked in my community in Alexandria, and I started paying a lot more attention and started voting on city council members who even mention housing, which they often don't. And it's just, I look at it, and it's certainly like this kind of homeschool civics I intend to bring to my children, but I wish it's something that we talked more about. And like I said, I just grew as an American, unexpectedly, nothing to do with, fighting the baddies and saving America, but really looking to the communities. And that's how we build America.
Absolutely. And I really like what you said about, it's not an issue that a lot of people talk about or pay attention to, but it's fascinating because it affects a large portion of our country, the housing crisis, from affordability to safe government housing. And I think, like you said, until you get up close and personal with an issue, unfortunately, that's typically the first time that most people care about it, because you just don't have to think about it. And so I really respect that. Is there any way that since you've left that fellowship, that it's changed the way that you look at issues in your community and how to get your hands dirty with those issues, and maybe even dictated, like you said, with your parenting style of how you're going to introduce those things to your child?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there are a few things. One, I grew up in South San Jose, so friends on food stamps, friends in mansions, like it kind of all mixed together in our public school. And so I'd grown up with a number of friends in government housing, going over there to play, and I really thought I understood, like this portion, socioeconomic portion of our community. And then I became an adult. Like, none of these parents were like, telling me their woes or their frustrations. I just went to their house as a kid. I had zero concept. And I remember speaking to this woman in Texas, and she had lost her housing, and she had a 16-year-old boy. She'd been in prison, and in prison she had gotten into a fight, and she lost her hearing. And I was trying to help her find housing. We found housing in Arizona, and she said, "Can you help me with my benefits?" And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" She said, "I want to work. It is important for me to show my son how important I did something bad. I, did my time. I'm now trying to show my son how to be a good citizen. But if I work, I lose my hearing aids. And if I can't have my hearing aids, I can't work." And she was stuck in this loop, right? As far as like what she was being given as far as benefits go, and I had no idea, obviously, that this was such a binary system. And it's completely changed the way I look at everything. Like, here's a woman that wants to work, that wants to be more productive in society, that wants to pass on these really strong, important values to her son. But the government, because it's very easy to dictate down and tell these people, whatever it was, nobody's asking, nobody's listening. Hey, what do you need? What do you value? How do we get you there? And it's fundamentally changed the way I look at anything when it comes out to benefits, or when it comes out to just the narrative in general that we give people. People want to contribute. They want to work. They want to have value in both their own life and in their community and in society. And every single thing that I do, whether it's, opinions that I share, or write about or vote on is all around how do we enable people to reach their maximum capability, and take a more positive look at humanity in general, I think.
It's amazing. I think I could talk to you all day about this topic, but I know we have limited time together. So tell us what you're doing now.
Yeah, so after the White House Fellowship, I went to InQTel, which is like the intelligence community's venture arm. I was really into comms, autonomous systems, ended up running one of the space investment portfolios over there. And now I work at this company called SkyFi. And if you had told me 2 years ago that I would be into space and my son would be into space and we'd be tracking satellites, I would have been like, we don't know each other. But I met the SkyFi team a little over a year ago, and essentially what we are building at SkyFi is this geospatial platform for the world. So there are almost 9,000 satellites in low Earth orbit right now, taking pictures of the Earth all the time. But the satellite industry itself is still, it's very constrained because the government is still the primary consumer, right? It's also still the most sophisticated consumer. And so really like the birth of our company was, you can buy a house online, you can buy a car online, but you can't buy an updated satellite image without talking to a company, $500,000 minimum, tell us your use case, send us a vial of blood, what's your mother's maiden name? You go through all of this and you're like, goodness, I just want a picture of whatever. And so that's why we've built it. We essentially, you can download the app on your phone, you can task a satellite while we're sitting here talking. And the idea is to bring this geospatial, not only the data, but the analytics, because there are some amazing AI companies that are being built around this. And interestingly enough, like some older algorithms where you can pull a free image. We have a European Space Agency satellite, Imagery, on the platform right now on SkyFi. And you can pull one of those for free, and you can run a very basic algorithm for $5 on 25 square kilometers, and you can tell where all the water is and the level of water saturation. You can tell vegetation health. And to me, so often when I was at InQTel, I loved my government customers. They were amazing, but often I thought, man, if the CIA can use this, MSF, Red Cross, like all of these other amazing like do-gooders who are out, in the front on the frontier can use it, and industry can use it. How much better would we be if we could take a lot of this technology and bring it to farming, more responsible mining, construction, real estate, disaster response, all these things. And the cool thing about SkyFi is I run the business development and strategy there. And we are very consumer facing. It's very international. That the sophistication of the consumer needs to rise, and that just comes through exposure and education like anything else. And we've really taken it on that is our responsibility to educate this market and bring it to them. And it is so fun. Being at an early stage startup of 31 people, the last time I was this professionally fulfilled was combat, because nobody's coming to save you. Nobody's coming in and they're like, oh, you screwed up that deal. That's okay. We'll get Bob to do it. There is no Bob. I am Bob. And so it's exciting. And the team that we have at SkyFi is amazing. All A players, constantly. Like everybody's throwing out ideas, creativity. Again, very much like when you're in combat. You're like, we have a problem. Here's a solution. Here's like this crazy moonshot solution. Well, today that one looks good, so let's try it. And I'm really, really enjoying it.
I've never heard of the connection between combat and working in a startup, but it's fantastic. And anyone that's dabbled in both is going to relate to that on a personal level. Amazing. Talk about some of the initiatives that you all at SkyFi are putting forward to educate people, because I think that's a really fascinating thought. You have to educate your consumers. So what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's working with our enterprise customers, like these big ag companies, like I said, mining, of like, here are all of the tools out there. We also do a ton of organic. We have most of our growth at this point is actually organic. So I didn't have any social media a year ago, and now I'm all over it because I've seen the value of like really getting out there and sharing ideas, education pieces. We try really hard to provide as much free data and imagery as possible. So like I said, there's a number of satellites that are put up by the European Space Agency, by NASA and USGS, that essentially is free. But to get to it, you have to essentially be a geospatial expert. So what we've done is make it really easy. One of our like secret sauce is really in our manpower. And I know that there's one on my team that she's a Gen Zer would correct me on our human power. And it's really about, who we've hired. And most of our engineers are ex-Uber and ex-FinTech. So with the exception of 2 people, nobody of the 31 came on as a geospatial person. And we really think that we like to keep that ethos, make it accessible, because people are curious. Actually, our biggest customers are commodity traders, because there's that information arbitrage and they're always curious more. Give me what's the new latest thing. And we're actually learning a lot from them as well. We are constantly paying attention of like, okay, where's the, oh my gosh, I'm a startup person about to use this word, but where are the synergies in the use case? I'll use ecosystem next and we'll be done for. But where are the synergies in the use case? How can we use some of this to like educate folks and really get out there? And we're really just at the beginning of it, to be honest. I mean, it's been an amazing and exhausting year, and I'm excited that we're only going to grow more and really raise up, because our bet, and I truly believe this, in the next 7 to 15 years, nobody is going to make a major decision in business without some sort of geospatial analytics contributing to that decision.
Love all that. I really like the point, too, about not oversaturating your staff with experience, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And bringing in outsiders, quote unquote, with just a different lens. I think that just, especially in a startup environment, it's an incredibly important approach. So fantastic. Let's talk about you outside of all these incredible professional things that anyone that looked you up on LinkedIn could find. How do you spend your days?
Well, I have a 5-year-old, so much of my time is spent with him. Balancing a early stage startup, which is a baby kind of unto itself, its own sort of toddler, and, being a mom, and, I have a great husband, but he's often overseas. It's definitely an interesting balance, but, it may be a little cliche, but the village is important. And my sister lives down the street. Like, my son is being raised by this amazing group of aunties and a few uncles here and there. But I think, I don't know if it's a woman thing, or I'll just speak for myself, not the entire sex. It took a while for me to take people up on their offer to help, because I kept feeling like I was putting somebody out. And I wanted to do all these amazing things, and also felt guilty, like, here's this tiny human that's amazing and really exciting, and, we want more. And how am I balancing my time on making him feel important? We believe strongly that he was going to become part of the family, not the center of it, but he kind of is the center of my world in many ways, and a lot of anxiety around making sure that he felt safe. And I'm only 5 years into this motherhood thing, so we can check back in 5 more years. But he's kind of my sidekick. Like, this kid has more miles than I ever did, and he's this great traveler. He's very curious. Don't get me wrong. I want to give him away for free sometimes, okay? So, like, let me not over-beautify this picture, but there isn't a day that goes by that I don't know, it's being a mother is my favorite thing. Now, I need other things in my life to feel completely fulfilled. Everybody has their own flavor of that, and I respect everybody's decisions on it. But, yeah, my day is filled with work, often going to see one of these amazing people in my village, although they're really good at coming to me, especially if they don't have kids yet. And my son, like, gosh, I've gotten crafty. I didn't know I was crafty, but apparently I'm crafty. And it's just really fun, and to bring him into as much as possible. He loves satellites. I have this great picture when I was at InQTel of these two women that I worked with. We were working on a particular portfolio company technology. And there's my son walking around with them, taking, 3D imagery with this camera. And it's kind of this thing that to go back to kind of some of our original theme, and really the theme of, your podcast, is I don't have to tell my son women are equal. He's surrounded by them. And it's just the act of being, right? Like, here are these two women. They're the only two engineers he knows. And they're just engineers, and they're his aunties, And the first astronaut he ever met, he was 3 years old. He was overjoyed. She was a woman. And I didn't have to say astronauts can be women too. It doesn't even compute for him. And I really, really do want to reach a point, hopefully, in society in general, but in my house, we don't have to talk about a lot of diversity because he doesn't know any different, right? His friends are all the colors of the rainbow, and he's going to public school, which is intentional with that, like diversity comes in many things that you can't see, right? And so just to live it, he'll grow up into a world with plenty of bias, but his core, his foundation will just be kind of judging and accepting the individual as that individual instead of some preconceived notions of what somebody should or shouldn't be.
That's beautiful. I love that. And I can definitely think back to moments in my childhood where something was different and it was introduced to me, and it wasn't until later in life, maybe until adulthood, where I was first confronted with the notion that, oh no, this isn't how it normally is. Yeah. And it's crazy when you realize that the way things are introduced to you as a child really set a foundation for how you see the world. How did you I don't want to say get over, because I would imagine that you still struggle with this emotion, but how did you become more comfortable with asking for help and leaning on others? Because I wholeheartedly believe that is a huge struggle with, women that are parents, not parents, working, parent full-time, whatever it may be. It's I think ingrained in us at a young age to just do the work and keep your head down, and especially if it's something that traditionally society is expecting of you, to not ask for help. So how have you worked to be comfortable with that feeling?
Yeah, I can't say I'm still fully comfortable with it. I think I just lean into it. I try to pay it forward to friends. A lot of friends that I lean on don't have kids, but you just kind of start to trust people to mean what they say, especially people who love you. And, often I have this conversation of, I can ask you if you promise to tell me that you can't do it. If you don't feel obligated to do it, I feel more comfortable taking you up on the offer. And so it is like being very articulate and upfront about it. And I've had friends in the past where I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to take this last minute, trip or whatever. Can you watch, we call him the Cub. Can you watch the Cub? And they'll say like, Kate, I can't this time. I'll be like, okay, cool, thank you. And nobody feels guilty. Nobody feels obligated. And the more that has happened, the more comfortable I am when they're like, yeah, absolutely, bring them over, And it's cool too because, before I had kids, I was the cool auntie. I still try to maintain some of my cool auntie status. And it's a way that I participate in my friends' lives as well as, showing up not just for them, but establishing a relationship with their children. And I love saying that with my friends in my village and my family. And as long as people, like I said, kind of lay the ground rules, feel okay to say no, I feel okay to ask.
That's great. That's great. You've been through a lot in your time on Earth. You've juggled a lot of hats between military service and a very demanding and emotional at times capacity. You have an incredibly important role in a growing startup, and you're a mom. Do you struggle with stress and anxiety at all?
Oh my gosh.
I think we all do, so it's a loaded question, but
yeah.
I guess my question would be, how have you learned to live with that and cope with that?
It's a good question. I think some days you could run a metropolis on my anxiety. I'm still figuring it out. I'm terrible at meditation. I'm too much of a multitasker to meditate well. I try to focus really strongly on like kind of the physiological things that I can control. I have this great mattress that actually cools and warms based on an algorithm, and sleep at the end of the, no pun intended, at the end of the day it's so important for your brain health chemistry. Your brain chemistry health. And the more I focused on that, try to have healthy habits at the end of the day so that I can get to sleep. Staying asleep is always my struggle. I like to wake up at 3:08. I have no idea why it's 3:08, but at 3:08 and completely panic about something totally trivial. And a lot of that has been trying to figure out, like, how do I counteract that, right? I have a book next to my bed that I turn on the light and I read, or lists, and so I think it's a constant battle. I wish I had a solution to it, but I think this is where we can recognize what we need to reduce our anxiety, and we can play that role in other people's lives. So when, my boss, or even chatting with my husband, or people in my life whose opinions matter, when they can be like, hey, you're doing well. I don't need a lot of attaboys. I don't need a ton of support. I came into this world possibly overconfident, I don't struggle with that, but I started to realize how important that is for that anxiety piece. So I try to pay it forward, make sure that people know they're doing well, or people don't rest in any sort of ambiguity professionally, or even when you can show up for somebody and reassure them hey, you're a really good mom. You're a really good, whatever it is. I really appreciated when you showed up. The more that there's kind of that balanced amount of positive reinforcement, I think for me that has helped me in those moments of feeling overwhelmed to be like, I got this, I've gotten it so far. At some point I'm not going to get it, but that's okay, because then I'll bounce back from not getting it. So that was a very long-winded and not direct answer, but I don't know.
It's a big topic.
Yeah.
It's so big that it's crowding a lot of lifestyle spaces on podcasts and in the media and whatnot. And I'm glad that I do believe our society is shifting towards prioritizing sleep, which you spoke about. But I know that especially for a lot of service members, we're taught to not prioritize sleep over the course of our career, and that becomes kind of a norm. And I know that for a lot of my friends, especially who have transitioned out of the military, getting used to prioritizing their wellness a little bit more feels a little guilty, but we can't be our full selves without sleep, and it's more important than exercise. It's really more important than anything. We can't function without it. So thank you for sharing that. Well, I just have a few more questions for you. I know that we've been going for a while, but Kate, who is your woman in the arena? Who is somebody that you look up to and admire, somebody that encouraged you to lean into your confident, authentic self and burst through those doors, as we talked about before?
Yeah, my mom. My mom was a homemaker. She is the reason my sister and I are successful. My dad was an amazing, amazing part of our life, for sure. But my mom always showed up. She never said no. Well, she said no to, staying out late and partying, but there was never anything that she didn't lean into. If we showed an interest in something, she would take us there. She believed that education wasn't just in the classroom, it was in experiences. And, I was a pretty good student until college. But so much of what I learned was, my family drove cross country one year, just drove from California to Maine and back, because that's what we could do. And my mom was always, without being, she never had a lesson plan. When I said I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, she asked so many questions, and then she supported it. And, my sister and my dad were here. They could tell you about when I went to combat, and she was constantly like paying attention and like following and very worried. I didn't know any of that, and it's not that, well, she did well because she hid her emotions, but she was so supportive. And I truly, every time I have some crazy harebrained idea, like I'm going to go join a startup, I'm going to get out of the Marine Corps, I don't know, we'll see what comes next. My mom's always like, cool, how are you going to do it? Okay, awesome. And I take her example, not just into motherhood myself, but really in how like I approach people, like ask questions, be curious, and then believe them, and share what you have to share. And if there's a way to enable an experience or an introduction or anything, you just do that. And it's just not even something I think about anymore because I had that example of her growing up. And yeah, she was in the arena and she booted me into the arena with all of the love and safety too, right? If there's one place I can always go to, it's always to go home. And I hope to, like I said, provide that to my own children, but also just kind of live and exist in a way that enables other people that way.
I love that. And I love the connection back to the arena because one thing I want everybody to walk away from this podcast knowing is that there's so many arenas in life. There's motherhood arena, there's military arena, there's marriage arena, there's trying to get 8 hours of sleep arena. There's so many arenas of life and they're all so important. And I think your note on being a curious parent is so important because I feel as if as the demands of this world increase, the need to control as a parent must increase as well. And I think that can often be an anxiety response of wanting to control something in yourself and then maybe it coming out in your parenting. And I think it's beautiful that your mother led with curiosity. And I think you're doing that too, based off of some of the things you shared today. So
certainly
I think,
aim for it.
Yeah, I think you're continuing that legacy. Well, Kate, thank you so much. I feel like we covered so much today, and I like I said, I could talk to you all day about some of the things we touched on. We do have a little gift for you. It's a bracelet with a quote from our Woman in the Arena poem, and I hope that you can wear it in moments where you feel like you're in the arena of life, whether it's tending to your village or your startup or whatever it may be, and just know that you have an arena of women cheering you on, and we're so thankful that you could contribute your story, and it's undoubtedly going to touch a lot of people, so thank you.
This is amazing, and what you guys are doing is amazing. At the end of the day, telling stories is how we share and how people grow. So really, really love what you guys are doing, and thank you so much for having me. It's been quite an honor.
Awesome. Thank you. The Women in the Arena podcast is powered by Iron Butterfly Media, a production company committed to honoring the lives of women who have had an unseen and outsized impact on our world. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have a woman who you would like to nominate as a guest, please shoot us a message on our social media platforms. Be sure to subscribe and follow on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. See you next time.